Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I've faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of Pioneer Mindset. So, the farm's a busy place. There's work to do, no time to waste. That's a quote from one of the kids' books, and I read it all the time. And just really kind of a good quote there. And so, hopefully, by the time you're hearing this mid-November, hopefully things are starting to slow down a little bit. But, usually it's still just a really busy time. Even after harvest, I'd say that's typically when the busy work really starts. Because, when we're in harvest, when we're trying to pick the crop and cut the beans and do all that stuff, whatever we're trying to get accomplished, we know what the tasks are at hand. We know everything that needs to be accomplished and is hammered out. But once that's done, then it turns to all the things that we need to get done before, winter really sets in, before the weather changes, while we have the opportunities to do those. But at the time I'm recording this, we're looking at end of October. And so we've been really busy, with harvest, but with everything else that's going on in the fall. I really enjoy fall because there's so much opportunities, so much work to do. Now, when that's early fall, when you start, chopping silage, putting up fourth cutting alfalfa, maybe doing some custom drilling, maybe helping the neighbors with some of those different labor situations, because there's so much to do, so much work to be done in the fall. There's so many opportunities out there. Like I said, whether it be to, start getting into the fields, to combining, to, maybe it's doing some baling, some corn stalks baling, or some drilling like we've been doing. And like I said, hauling grain. I could go on and on with everything that we need to do in the fall. And with that comes a lot of opportunities. Like I said before, there's just so many opportunities. And so with this episode, I want to actually dive into, how do you see custom work and helping other people out in the business of the fall? And so, how do you view custom work in your eyes? Do you view it as an opportunity, or do you view it as an obstacle? And so for most operations, I'd say, a lot of people do custom work to some extent, whether it be a small amount, just helping the neighbor. Maybe it's just going over there and helping them with labor. Maybe, you're taking your combine over there and helping them cut some beans. Maybe you're helping them do some windrowing throughout the year. Maybe did some custom baling or just something like that. We're always kind of helping neighbors, trading labor, helping them as much as we can. To some extent, the odds are that you do some of that throughout the year. And so for some operations, maybe that's a bigger portion than others. All right. And so when we talk about custom work, should I do custom work or should I not? And just kind of diving into all of that. And so another thing that I really like about the fall and the busyness, and this is going to kind of go back to the mindset that I feel like a lot of us were taught and trained and conditioned to have, was if you work hard, you'll make a good living. Now, you've probably heard me say that many times before, because that's how I was taught and trained and conditioned to grow up, by my dad and by the generation before him, my grandpa. And I was always kind of told that, if you work hard, you'll make a good living. If you just be honest, be somewhat conservative, you'll be all right, And so I feel like in the grand scheme of things, that has changed a lot. But in the fall, when there's so much work to do on the farm, around the farm, whatever that it looks like. I mean, there's just so much opportunities for work to be done. I feel like that's one time of the year where we can adopt this mindset and actually be, somewhat, I don't want to say profitable, but it just can really generate a lot of revenue and can really capitalize on all the opportunities that are out there. And so we can put forth our labor and we can get paid for it. We can be rewarded for our time, right? And so that's why I want to kind of dive into this and see what this actually looks like. And so when we talk about custom work, and obviously there's different opinions on custom work, whether it's something that somebody should chase or not, whether it's worth it or not. Everybody's got their own opinions, and everybody's opinions are shaped from whatever they've been through in the past. However, maybe they were taught and trained and conditioned, right? And so let's just kind of dive into, what are the pros and cons of actually doing custom work? And before we get into this custom work thing, I've mentioned it before, but maybe we should, kind of clarify what is custom work. Well, in my opinion, Maybe it's you have, a combine and maybe the neighbor needs help combining. Maybe his combine broke down, or maybe just got a few acres that he doesn't own his own combine. So we go over there, we perform a service, and then you get paid for that service. Probably the same way if somebody comes in and helps you do the same thing. It goes both ways here. If maybe chopping. A lot of people in our area chop corn silage, but not many people do that many acres, so they don't have their own machines. So typically they have a custom crew come in and they do that. Now, there are people that do strictly just do custom work. They have equipment and they go around and they perform these services for others and just do custom work. All right. But there's also a lot of farmers around here that like, well, I'll just kind of help this guy out if I can, or maybe I don't have enough acres, so I do custom work on the side to kind of help pay for the equipment. We're going to kind of dive into that a little bit. And so that's what I mean when it comes to custom work is I mean, any sort of, like I said, performing a service for somebody else and then paying you to do that. And I guess, like I said, the busyness in the fall, some of that could also be just you going over there and physically helping somebody and being a hired hand for them or filling in for them, kind of being that seasonal labor to some extent, right? So I feel like that's maybe not necessarily custom work, but when it comes to the busyness of the fall, like I said, that can also be of value to others, and you get paid for that, right? You get paid on your time that you spend over there and that value that you provide to them, okay? And so let's dive into the custom work. The pros and cons, what are they? Let's kind of establish it. Let's lay it all out there and see what this actually looks like. I'm going to start with the cons first here. So one of the cons early on might be just extra labor. Maybe you don't have the time to, go and help the neighbors. Maybe you don't have the time to do a bunch of custom work or combining or baling in the fall or drilling. Maybe you just don't have the time. Maybe you don't have the equipment. Okay. Maybe your equipment is just set up for your operation and that's it. Or maybe maybe it's on the contrary where you're actually having to hire somebody come in and help you in some cases. And it just depends on each individual context and their situation. But also, another kind of con here would be is maybe it's just more wear and tear on your equipment. Maybe your equipment's not set up to do some of these different things. And it's maybe just don't want to have to worry about the additional repairs that could come from more acres that your equipment covers. So you might have additional repairs there. And then also the big one here that I think a lot of people focus on when it comes to the big con is it could take away from your own operation. All right. So if you are putting somebody else's needs before yours, so kind of side story here, that's kind of what we did this last week to some extent. As I'm recording this, last week, we did a lot of custom work. We had a neighbor whose combine was broke down and he needed help finishing beans. And we were at kind of mid to end of October. So we actually went and helped him finish beans. Now, our beans were done already, so we're not necessarily putting our beans on the back burner like some people do, but we had to still finish our corn. So our corn got put on the back burner while we went and actually helped him finish beans. Same for, my dad went and did that, kind of sent him loose with the combine, and then I focused on doing some custom drilling. Same thing there, is we went and did a lot of custom drilling, even though we were not done drilling our own cover crops, and we could have definitely been focusing on that. But when it comes to custom work here, one of the big cons that I feel like a lot of people focus on is just the fact that it takes away from your operation, which can be a costly thing, right? It just depends on the weather. It just depends on logistics, just depends on the yields. And so that's another con here is, if you take away from your own operation, maybe you set your corn or beans aside and you come back to them, maybe you're going to hurt your yield a little bit. Maybe they're going to lose moisture. And when you lose moisture, you lose yield. All right. So there's a couple different kind of cons they're really focus on. And so that'd be a big one there that I feel like a lot of people tend to get hung up on. And that's the big one that's kind of a showstopper for them from maybe not doing more custom work. Or maybe they did some custom work and they just didn't feel like it was worth it because of all these negatives, these cons. So they ultimately just shied away from it or went back to just focusing on their own operation. Another one here is just kind of like I said, back to your context or back to the things that we can't always control, but maybe it's the weather considerations. Maybe we're looking at the time of the year where we're getting pushed into the fall a little bit and we're looking at maybe a wet spell coming up and we just don't want to mess with that. So that could be definitely a con because there too, if we focus entirely on somebody else's operation and we just leave ours to the back burner, yeah, we're going to probably feel that in a negative way, right? Maybe like I said, reduced yields, maybe a lot of losses in the field because of maybe the crop got too dry or maybe we didn't get to it in time and had to sit there for a long time. And then the last one here when it comes to a big con is just the added stress and the added hours and manpower that it takes to do custom work and to go help the neighbor when they need it. Or like I said, just to do custom work in general takes a lot of hours and adds a lot of stress, right? Adds a different set of complexities when we're working with other people trying to facilitate logistics and trying to figure out how this is going to work versus, just strictly focusing on ourselves and, which is easy. That's what we know, that's what we're familiar with, right? And so there's definitely a lot of added stress when it comes to doing some custom work. I'd say that's a pretty good rundown of the cons. Maybe there's some other ones that you can think of in your mind or that you've witnessed or that you've experienced over the years. But those are kind of the ones that I was kind of thinking of that are forefront of mind. And the big one there was just be the fact that it takes away from your own operation when you're doing custom work. And so the pros here we can kind of run down this and not necessarily in any particular order, but the nice one here when it comes to doing custom work is it does spread out your equipment cost. So maybe it helps you actually justify equipment as well. So those two kind of go hand in hand with, okay, maybe I've got a pretty big planter, maybe I've got a pretty big combine, and it's pretty hard to justify that just for the acres that I cover. But if I do some custom work, bring in some additional revenue that way, it helps spread out that cost. And I will say, kind of side note here, is that can be a slippery slope because that's ultimately how a lot of people do justify, maybe this new combine. Well, I really want this combine. No, I don't think I can justify it with my acres. But Mr. Banker, if I do some custom work, if I pick up a couple hundred acres, maybe even 1,000 acres of custom work, I can definitely make this pay. And that is definitely true. But I feel like that's also can be a slippery slope is because that's how we talk ourselves into those pieces of equipment, into those purchases. We really talk ourselves into it. Now, whether you actually go through and you do the custom work and you follow up with what your plan was and you actually, capitalize on the revenue and those opportunities, that's all to be determined, right? But if you do have some equipment costs, maybe it just really helps kind of spread that out and maybe helps justify the equipment that you have. Because there are a lot of operations out there that maybe everything needs to be done in a timely manner, right? I'd say typically we have some pretty short windows to get the operations on the farm accomplished, whether that be planting, spraying, whether that be, like I said, harvesting. I didn't even mention spraying before. When it comes to custom work, that's a big one there that a lot of people can actually capitalize on there. But when it comes to trying to get everything done and do it ourselves, we don't have to pay somebody else to do it. So we're trying to save on that regard. So we're investing into the machinery. We're investing in the equity of the machinery. And so now all of a sudden we need to maybe cover a few more acres just to make that pay. And so it's a good plan there. It really is a good business plan, but we just got to be really careful how we analyze that. So that way we're not utilizing that to get into purchases that are probably above our means that we can't necessarily make cash flow, right? And so a couple different ways we can look at that. All right. So then just literally be added additional revenue. That's a pro. That's additional revenue. And so I wanted to mention here on our farm this last week, okay, so we did just kind of some rough numbers. It was roughly, I think, 350 acres of custom combining beans, right? And so I think just throwing out the rough number there, I think it's about $10,000 worth of just additional revenue from custom combining in 1 week, okay? And that was actually only about 3 days that we took to do all that work, 3-4 days. And then the custom drilling, we did probably about 400 acres of that, maybe a little bit over. And so that was a good week there. And so we had a lot of good revenue that's going to be pulled in from that as well. And so that's to where we can really bring in additional revenue. And that's where we really start to see these as opportunities. But we do have to balance the pros and cons. But with that additional revenue, the one thing that I really like about this is another big pro is it really helps the cash flow, not only from an additional cash flow standpoint, because that's that revenue that comes in. We all know that's not just pure profit, right? It's pretty easy to see that as pure profit, but we got everything that went into that, your labor, your equipment repairs, your fuel, your depreciation on the equipment, and all of those other expenses that went into that. So we know that it's not pure profit, but there's a pretty good chunk of revenue that's coming back to your bottom line, that's coming back to your bank account, and it's coming back sooner, okay? So it's a different time frame than what, say, your own operation would be. This is where I thought it was an interesting perspective because if you're going to be combining, say, 400 acres for yourself versus 400 acres for somebody else, right? So that 400 acres for yourself, you're harvesting your own crop. The majority of that crop's probably going to go in the bin. You're not going to just probably sell it right out of the field typically. So that's going to be going into the bin and you're not going to see the revenue from that from probably a few months, right? Probably at least 3-4 months down the road if you're going to hold on to it until spring or a different time of year before we actually sell that crop and see that revenue from those acres that you harvested. Versus on the flip side, if we're doing custom work and we're doing that same 400 acres, right? And that's an accounts receivable back to your operation, probably on a net 30 terms if you can stay on top of getting those invoices sent out. At maximum, maybe 45, 60 days, right? By the time we actually get some of that back in. So it's a little bit quicker time frame. We're going to be having that revenue coming in a different time frame, really going to help some of those different cash flow times, right? And like I said, throughout the year, if you're doing, say, custom spraying, custom haying, or anything like that, that's to where that additional revenue, that different timing of that revenue, different timing of that cash flow just makes things work a little bit easier. Makes things kind of go throughout the year, just makes it a little bit easier to cash flow, be positive cash flow, and actually have, a better return there, right? And so the other couple of things here that I want to add to the pros is it just builds connections, right? It builds connections as we do more custom work. Maybe you start custom combining for a neighbor, all right? And that kind of maybe builds that connection. You're talking to them more often. You're building the relationship there. And then maybe all of a sudden you're saying, hey, by the way, down the road, respectfully, by the way, if you ever get to where you want to slow down, maybe just keep us in consideration. And you already have that relationship started there and building that trust and that you can do a good job, provide value back to them. And so maybe you kind of get your foot in the door, right? So that's a really good opportunity there as well. Or maybe it's just building connections from different people across the county. I was doing some drilling for a guy that was a couple counties away. So just kind of building that connection, maybe it's down the road to where you need something from him, right? Or he helps you in some different way, shape, or form. Or maybe it's just the building the relationships and the networking and the knowledge. And the last one here that I'd say is that pro is just maybe getting a little bit of perspective. What I'm kind of really talking about here is, so when I was doing this drilling for this guy, I went to a different kind of region. I guess it was only about a county away, about 30 miles away, but it was just kind of geographically a little bit different region. They had different types of fields, a lot of terraces, a lot of smaller fields, and just a little bit different landscape there. And so once I got over there after a day or two of drilling over there, it really gave me some perspective that we take our fields around here for granted. A lot of our fields are, fairly good sized fields. There are no terraces. We're farming straight through a lot of stuff, and the ditches are pretty minimal. And so I really was taking our ground for granted. So it was a little bit of perspective, right? But then also being exposed to different operations out there, the different things, the different challenges that other people deal with just gives you a little bit of perspective. And perspective never really hurts anything. It just kind of shapes the way that we think sometimes and maybe makes us a little bit grateful for the things that we do have. Or maybe we see other operations out there and we can learn from them and kind of just, like I said, pick up different things here and there. So that's kind of the big pros there that I saw. And once again, you could probably add some more to that you've experienced in your past or maybe that you've witnessed before. But those are kind of the big pros that I would come up with. And obviously the big one there would be kind of that additional revenue, different timing, and to spread out that equipment cost, right? But let's definitely not forget about the connections, because I think that one's one that we do forget about, because that one is very important to build those connections up. And we've done custom work for a number of years. We did custom work combining for a few different guys in the past. They've got larger operations, and we do custom combining of beans. And beans are always good to get out at a good moisture. So we go over there and we just kind of knock out a few days of beans for them and just building those connections. Like I said, maybe down the road, you never know when you might need that or that'll come back around. So let's move on from this and let's ask ourselves to do custom work or not to do custom work, right? So the big ones here is, let's just not forget about our context. Let's not forget about our situation. We might look at Joe Schmo down the road who's doing all this custom work and thinking maybe I should do that, but we got to consider all these things. We got to consider what is our labor force look like? What does our equipment look like? Do we have the capabilities to do this? I was talking with another guy that does some custom drilling here this last week, and he's like, I'm honestly trying to get out of it. I'm trying to phase out of it. And I said, well, just out of curiosity, why is that? I was just curious. And he's like, well, I'm a one-man band. It's really hard to do all of this custom drilling when I've got my own operation and my own acres that I'm trying to cut as far as, corn and beans and trying to harvest and all that. So he said, it's just, I don't have the time, right? And so that completely makes sense. That completely makes sense. So looking at our own individual context and trying to analyze that, try not to get too sidetracked with shiny objects into what everybody else has got going on and what they're doing, right? Because we might see all these operations. Maybe you got a guy that's only farming a small amount, but he's doing all this custom work, and we see all the opportunities that he has. And so maybe we get sidetracked with what we have. Or, literally vice versa. Maybe looking at the neighbor who doesn't do any custom work, knocks out his acres on a very timely manner. He's done with harvest early. and he's put the combine away way before you are, and you're still working out here at all hours of the day into November, all the way to Thanksgiving or whatever the case is. And so it goes both ways, right? Just really consider your context. But the big thing here, another question to ask is, what are you striving for? What are you chasing? Then lastly, what fulfills you? So there's a lot of different things that are really consider is, what are you striving for? Are you literally just chasing that dollar? Or are you trying to build the connections? Are you trying to provide value to others? Are you chasing the dollar, but acknowledge that, right? But then ask what fulfills you. Okay, does it fulfill you to cover more acres or new acres or be across different landscapes? That's kind of a side note there. Is that something that I don't mind doing when it comes to custom work? And then when it comes to a set aside from the business side, set aside from the profitability side, getting down to what you truly enjoy, because there's all kind of that little kid inside of us, right? What's the things that we enjoy? So part of it for me is, yes, it's operating the machinery, but sometimes it's just being on the back 40 over that hillside or in the back 120 or just kind of in different landscapes, different areas, different regions. I think it's just kind of an interesting part that I enjoy. So what actually fulfills you? Okay. Does it fill your cup to be helping other people, to be doing all this work, to be working long hours, or is that something that you don't enjoy? So we really have to analyze all of those different things. Now, like I said, then back to, your context. Do you have the equipment to do this? Do you have the capabilities? Are you literally going to be putting 100% of your stuff on the back burner and trying to do custom work? Because, I think we can both agree that's not necessarily always going to be the best idea as well. So lots of things to consider here. But the big question here that I want to ask, and it's probably the big question that you're asking yourselves anytime we're like trying to figure out, is this worth it? All right. So is the juice worth the squeeze? We've always heard that phrase. And I think it's a really, really good question when it comes to custom work, because yes, if we go do custom work and we're performing a service and we're providing value to somebody else, we're getting paid for that. But is that juice worth the squeeze? Is that money, is that additional revenue worth everything that it costs to get to that point? And the big thing here that we need to also consider, a couple big takeaways with that question is the juice worth the squeeze? Is, like I said, going back to your context, but also consider what season are you in? Okay. This goes hand in hand with that. What season are you in? Are you in the season of, okay, my kids are grown up and, I'm not busy with other stuff, right? I'm not sidetracked with little kids, or I'm not sidetracked with grandkids quite yet. Maybe I've got an opportunity. I can spend more time here out in the fields in the fall and more labor. Maybe you're just a young buck before you're even married, before you even have kids, and maybe you got all the time in the world. You want to farm day and night, all day, all hours of the day, and just get after it, right? So consider what season you're in. And maybe you're in the season of, I do have young kids, and so this is a really tough call to actually be gone all the time. So you do the best you can to balance that out. Or back to, like I just mentioned before, the neighbor that I was talking to is a one-man band. His son hasn't come back from college yet, hasn't come back to the operation. So what season are you currently in? And the big part here is to consider, like I said, consider the season you're in, that it's just a season, right? It's not a lifetime. All right. So maybe we go do custom work for a few years while it works out, or we do it until all of a sudden the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? Until we kind of analyze that, or we come up with that conclusion ourselves, right? Ourselves, not relying on somebody else to help us with that one. So maybe we consider, when is the juice worth the squeeze? Maybe we try to go after it. Maybe we chase acres that are 30 miles away this year, but maybe not next year, right? Just kind of consider that and then learn from that, but then also give yourself a little bit of grace to acknowledge all the things that you've accomplished. Because the one thing here when it comes to doing custom work and running so hard or running rampant in the fall, whether it's custom work or not, whether it's just focusing on an operation or not, this is one thing I don't think we do enough, is to acknowledge everything that we've got accomplished. Now, a good way to do that is actually going back to having Monday morning meetings within your operation, within yourself, with you and your spouse, just to acknowledge everything that you've gotten accomplished just within the last week. Okay, how many acres did you cover? How many fields did you cover? How many bushels did you move? How much custom work did you do? How much revenue does that add up to? And not necessarily always to build your ego, but just to acknowledge that all of my work that I've put in has accomplished something. And we've done something with that, all right? And so then back to that question of, is the juice worth the squeeze, and what season are you actually in? Be okay with, okay, this is the season that we're currently in, and that could change. And that will change, really, because it's always going to change. All right. Maybe as my kids get older and they start getting into sports, maybe we're not going to be chasing this as much. Maybe you're in the season where you're just trying to chase that dollar because it's going to help out your current financial strain that you're in. maybe as you listen to this, you're chasing every dollar that you can, doing every custom work that you can, because you know that the row crop industry is facing some really hard times and there's a farm crisis out there. So you're working your tail off, doing all that you can to put some money away to make as much as you can. And maybe that's just this season. Maybe in a couple of years from now, that's going to change and all this work is paid off and you don't want to work that hard. That's okay. Just acknowledge what season that you're actually in. Now, the last one here, or I guess a couple last kind of key takeaways or things to remember here as we get to rounding this out. This all kind of comes down to mindset and expectations. Like anything else, by the way, this is pioneer mindset. We keep coming back to that, but this all kind of comes down to mindset and expectations. All right. So if you kind of make up your mind, say, hey, I want to chase some custom work for whatever the reason, for this, that, and the other, for X, Y, and Z, I'm going to go do some custom work. Well, have the mindset that first off, you're going to have to roll with the punches. That's what happened this last week is, we had a plan laid out for the week, but literally every single day, the plan changed even multiple times throughout the day. So have the mindset, just kind of an open mindset and roll with the punches that things are going to change, things are going to happen. If you cover more acres, by the way, you might have more breakdowns. That's just going to happen. And back to that con, by the way, try not to get rabbit hole here too much, but I've always thought that in my head, that's kind of a story that plays out. Well, our equipment's not the newest. If we keep running it hard like this to cover more acres, aren't we going to have more breakdowns? Yeah, you probably are. But guess what? Those are either going to happen now or they could happen in the future. Okay. Like, if we're going to have a breakdown on the combine after just because we covered 300 more acres of the custom work, yeah, maybe that's going to happen this year, but it was probably going to happen next year. Okay. At some point, if you're going to keep that machine, it's going to happen. So side comment there, but just kind of be mindful, have that mindset that things are going to happen, things are going to change, but then back to the expectations side of things, right? I think it's very important here as you get into doing custom work, or just even throughout the fall in general, having somewhat realistic expectations. And with that, expectations that I can accomplish all of this stuff, but then being open-minded that things are going to change, or being realistic to, okay, my drill, when we're planting, I should be able to cover 20 acres an hour because that's what it says that I'm doing when I'm planting at 6.5 miles an hour, 30-foot drill. I can cover 20 acres an hour. But how come it took me 10 hours to do this 60 acres? That doesn't quite make sense. You know what I mean? So just kind of throwing some numbers out there, you have to have realistic expectations. And part of that is just acknowledging that everything takes longer than you think and that we're going to do this, but we're going to roll with the punches and we're going to do the best job that we can. Just having those realistic expectations is really going to help to going into any sort of busy season, any sort of custom work where you're trying to do something new. The last one here is, what can we do when it comes to custom work or just in general, helping people out? What can we do to provide value to others? Because at the end of the day, yeah, we can admit that probably the reason we're doing some of this is to chase the money, chase the dollar, bringing that revenue back to the operation. Well, we all know that money is just the exchange of value. So if we're going to go about this process, what can we do to provide value back to those people that we're working with, that we're serving, that we're trying to help? We're doing custom work. We're just going over there and jumping in the tractor and helping them. What can we do to provide value to them? Because that's ultimately going to be the exchange of money. Our value that we provide to others, we hope that is rewarded in the exchange of a monetary value, right? And so that's just another thing to keep in mind as you're going about this, as we're thinking about this different episode and everything that I've covered so far is what can we do to provide value to others? And we see that and vice versa. If we get somebody that comes to do something for us, how valuable is that task that they did for us? And that's why we exchanged that value for money in the monetary form. So I covered a lot today, a longer episode than I wanted to, but really passionate about when it comes to talking about the custom work side of things. Lots of things to consider, whether it's right for you or not. I'm not going to say whether it is. I'm not going to say whether the juice is worth the squeeze because it all just depends on your operation, the season that you're in, and making sure that we have an open mindset and definitely have realistic expectations going into this. But I hope there's a lot of value. I hope there's something that you kind of take home from this today. I'd love to have this conversation around how, if this is something that works for you, maybe you should kind of shift your operation towards this. Or maybe this is something that, maybe doesn't work. I'd love to have that conversation. So you can always reach out to me. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram because I'll be talking more about kind of how we do custom work within our operations, but then how we analyze this within a cash flow standpoint. So I hope there's some value in today's episode, but otherwise we will catch you guys next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram at Garrett Ruskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.